Good afternoon. I'm going to resume the story of my military service. And first of all, just remind you, this is from Chapter 2 of Do Ask, Do Tell, A Gay Conservative Lashes Back, although there were signs of Don't Ask, Don't Tell existed already. And a little bit of it is covered in the third book. But let me go to the illustrations, which are in the year, this is where we were. We were talking about my going to be in the Pentagon, assigned to the Pentagon. Let me just backtrack over just a couple of other points at the end of the last video. One of the things I noticed that just about my appearance, toward the end of basic training, I noticed my legs felt very much stronger. I'd never felt stronger than this in my life. And it does show that a person that is physically way behind in the sense of what is expected of men can benefit from this intense training, including a military experience. It shows that perhaps it works, so that's interesting. If I had been discharged as unfit, then I wouldn't have the story to tell, would never have cared about gays in the military later on, and might have done much worse because I would have had a very poor reputation, I think. Another thing I noticed when toward the end of basic and after coming out of special training company, we did get a pass. I remember going into downtown Columbia and seeing the Truman Capote movie in Cold Blood. I remember seeing that, and running into people that had been in my first company. Since I was in a new company, I went from E41 to B21, and better than the best, to hell with the rest kind of thing, the esprit de score that they demand. But a couple of them were in AAT. They were still at Fort Jackson. They told me they had gotten infantry as their MOS, so they were going to go to Vietnam after 30 days of labor and be at very high risk. I could use the CF word. It sounds like a slur now. Also, I wanted to mention that right after I went into special training, I was called in for an interview with a psychologist who was young and good looking and so forth, but kind of treated it as a formality. He kind of asked some penetrating questions, but didn't really get that penetrating. So I think we knew what was going on. He was just trying to pretend that there were no gays around when we all knew there were. And then after I passed the PCPT in special training company, and I had 3 or 4 days left before going to a new company, I did get a call to go over and check on the direct commission application I had made very early at the time when I was in basic, when we went through processing, and we could apply for different MOSs and give our educational background. I was always telling people I have a master's degree in mathematics, which maybe I barely got, as we know at the end with that master's orals, and I would be pleading for my education. Of course, people would say I had a lot of book learning but no common sense. That whole thing, that was the too much education thing. In fact, I was told that when I was in special training. Sounds very potentially Marxist almost, but I did have an interview shortly after returning to the company. I did get orders to skip the training that day and go to a direct commission interview. And there were 3 officers who interviewed me, but what they asked about was, and I even had my master's thesis with me, which I showed you in a previous video. And what I showed them, what they asked me was about leadership, student council activity, had I ever run for office, had I politics, and essentially very, very interesting questions. Again, what they were leading for, they were thinking more about leaders of men in combat, I think, I still think back to the time that Arlington recruiter told me that 95% of draftees would get combat arms. And so I just wanted to cover all those things. I also just noticed in my physically, while I was feeling stronger, I noticed my hands were getting very chafed and my wrists were getting chafed and the hairs were falling out of them and so forth, because partly because of the cold early when we were there. It was colder than normal until early March, and I noticed that with some of the other people too. I sort of felt a little weird about that, but after I got out of basic training, everything came back. But anyway, the last weekend in May, before Memorial Day, I rode back to Arlington. Ironically, I was assigned to Fort Myer, and I would technically be living on South Post, in kind of a tense, kind of a barrack city. Actually, this is from another post museum, but that's what typical barracks look like. And but sometimes I stayed at home actually and just skipped because they didn't always check. And I would go into the office, and I worked on force development and just assembling statistics about combat support, combat service support, and combat arms itself. Those three categories. It was kind of what was what. And there were civilian employees there. And as time went on, I would also go to the library sometimes and read about stuff about nuclear war and what were the real risks. And remember that movie, The War Game, that British movie? That was this war really a test of whether we could avoid a deterrent with a nuclear war with China or maybe Russia. And one of the doctrines was if you had a strong conventional force, you were less likely to have nuclear war. If you actually could draft young men and get them to fight with their fists, so to speak, not their fingernails, but their fists, you were less likely to go nuclear. So that was one of the doctrines. I also, one of the civilians warned me about talking very much, that if you went and read stuff, you don't talk about it in front of the officers or in the office. And because there were several other O1E20s in the office with me that had been to other posts like Fort Leonard Wood and so forth. And we did talk about it sometime, and he's worried that was a good way to get transferred if you weren't careful. And by the way, that was another thing, the delay, the 6-week delay, because of my special training company might have precluded my being assigned here, but fortunately it didn't. But they warned, he warned me about that, and we would find out soon that maybe he wasn't wrong. You may have heard recently that Johnny Harris made a video about Operation Northwoods that was kept secret, a plan to invade Cuba in early 1962, which John Kennedy nixed. And there may have been people in that office that knew about it. I never did hear about that directly, but I wonder if, given that civilian's remark, I wonder if he knew or something, as they were worried. Because in late August, I got a call that I was going to be transferred, that I could look from a specialist in personnel, that I could look for OSD for the possibility of placement. And then I got a call very shortly thereafter that I was being transferred to Fort Eustis, which is, I wound up getting transferred suddenly down to the Combat Developments Command Transportation Agency. It's about 10 miles from Williamsburg, which is again ironic, southeast actually in the city of Newport News, Virginia. And we were in a white building, and we were in some eyebrow barracks that looked like, I think the previous picture, we were in barracks that looked like that on Fort Eustis, but we all had our own individual rooms. They were they had inspections, but not very often. And we never had KP. We were left alone. And I had a car then from my father. I bought a car from my father, Ford Galaxy, and so I could drive finally. I finally was more independent. And I did drive. I did go home some weekends to Arlington. Not always, but sometimes, often. I started reading more, reading novels. I read Atlas Shrugged, and I reading some Irving Wallace novels like The Plot and The Prize, and playing chess at the chess club in Newport News, where near the end of my time in the Army, I beat the Armed Forces champion in a game on the white side of the King's Indian Defense. That was something I did at Fort Eustis. I organized a couple of chess tournaments. That was sort of my contribution to the social life or the creative life on post, was organizing chess tournaments. I was sort of known and respected for that. And I didn't always win all the games either. There were some good players. I had an interview with a psychiatrist. I was called in also for an interview just to renew my clearance. I think I had been processed for a top secret clearance in the Pentagon, and that certainly might have fallen through given what had happened. But this was just to renew the secret clearance. And again, it was very obvious from the way I asked him, well, why are we having to have this conversation at all? And he said, well, I really don't know. I've just been told to do it, And he admitted that this was a sham, and we all knew what we were talking about. And the people in the barracks, we had a lot of fun. There were a lot of joking around with a couple of the guys especially, but most of them were pretty well educated. One of them was from Berkeley, was a PhD in chemistry, and I'll call his name he gave himself the name Rado Sewell, he was the other person in our office at the CDCTA, Combat Development Command's Transportation Agency, and then I'll call a guy named Oscar O'Malley. I'll give him a fictitious name. Was always kind of sort of playing dumb sometimes. He had a way of making fun of things that was interesting. But there were comments several times, a couple of times from the guys in the barracks that everybody knew there were homosexuals in the military, and everybody knew the Pentagon would someday have to admit it, and policies would have to change. That was said openly in the barracks a couple of times when I was down there in 1969. Now, it was possible that some people knew about the Stonewall riots in June. I didn't. I actually, that weekend, was on a church retreat at Shrine Mont. I should have included the picture. I actually played in a softball game that weekend and hit a home run on the first pitch that actually cleared a left field fence. So I was in better shape than I had ever been in my life. And I didn't. That was the same weekend that Stonewall was going on, and I didn't even know about it for a while. The new Washington Senators also had their best year in 1969. They were 86 and 76, and before the team was lost at the end of the 71 season. But anyway, so I finished out my term as a service and got out of the Army on January 6, 1970. There's the Army Museum, the new Army Museum at Fort Belvoir. And actually slightly off post so that civilians can go to it. It's about halfway between 495 and the Occoquan River when you drive down I-95. And here's a certificate of my right to go back from the fact that I was a veteran. My last known employer was the University of Kansas, so that would mean I could go back and teach math and flunk more students, except that now we had a lottery for the draft that's starting in '69, so we didn't have student deferments anymore, which were a big issue, which made the whole issue of grades, and staying in college so important was the student gave me power, which I probably shouldn't have had, created a sort of a moral issue of its own. And I started my civilian life. I worked for RCA for a year and worked in several locations, and that I wound up having my only layoff for a year later. I'm not going to go into that right here, but I will in another video in another series, but not part of this one regarding that I pitched in the Pitch Fest, because that was interesting. But I did want to mention, and that was in Indiana when I was working for RCA. It was a scene from Brown County. But I wanted to mention that I worked, my second job was back here in Washington. I actually got it through somebody I knew at the chess club in Washington. Somebody that I usually beat, but anyway. I got a job as a mathematician, and I learned more Fortran programming. And there again, it was the Naval Command System Support activity. It was in the Washington Navy Yard. The building has been completely renovated now. And we used to park on Water Street, which is now the wharf area in the district. But the interesting thing is, again, I had to be processed for its top secret security clearance, and it came back ambiguous. So what I wound up doing was moving to New Jersey and New York and working in private industry again. I went to work for UNIVAC in 1972, and that started a new sequence in my life. I lived in cities other than where I had grown up in for 16 years. And then it led eventually to the situation that would lead me to be interested in gays in the military. But that wasn't until living in New York and living in Dallas when the AIDS epidemic hit. And the fact that the gays in the military debate would come up only 10 years after AIDS had been an issue is interesting to me, but that's going to be covered in the next video. So this is the end of this sequence of my military service, and the next one we'll jump forward to chapter 4 in the Do Ask, Do Tell book, where I talk about the actual history of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and what I feel my role in repealing it actually turned out to be. And I do thank you very much for listening.